I'm very pleased to be here today and speak to you about our CIFR-funded project on superannuation. As we know, superannuation is a central pillar of Australia's very important retirement planning scheme. But current estimates are that most Australians are seriously underprepared for retirement. Some critical factors such as an ageing population, increased life expectancies, higher costs of living, and the inadequacy of many superannuation balances suggest strongly that Australians need to actively manage their superannuation accounts. And they need to be doing that from an earlier stage of their life. So our project responded to these challenges by identifying a particularly important demographic, those aged 25 to 34 who are entering in the workforce, contributing to superannuation, at a foundational time in their life to investigate their views, their attitudes, what determines these views and attitudes to superannuation. The research team consists of 5 academics across 2 faculties at the University of Melbourne, both the Faculty of Law and the Faculty of Commerce, and we have a statistician in the research team. I should mention that one of the key reasons why we focused upon this particular demographic of Australians aged 25 to 34 is because this is the demographic that is under-researched. As we know, there has been much excellent research concerning superannuation in Australia, but it is the younger demographic which, in our mind, has had insufficient research thus far. Now today, I'll be presenting preliminary results of our research. We are continuing to do testing with the data and explore the implications of our research, but today I am here to present most of our key findings. It's worth mentioning perhaps the background to this particular research project. At Melbourne Law School, for a number of years, we have been investigating issues to do with the disclosure of information about financial services and financial products. For example, a number of years ago, we conducted an Australian Research Council funded project on how Australians use prospectuses. More recently, we've just completed a major Australian Research Council funded project on levels of financial literacy of senior secondary school students. We used dual methodology, both surveying students, conducting roundtables with them, and our results indicated some significant concerns relating to levels of financial literacy at a time when these young students are actively engaged in buying financial services and financial products, buying mobile phones, buying goods online. So with that as background, we then identified a very important demographic, as I've mentioned, young adults in the workforce, in order to investigate their views on superannuation at a time, of course, when government policy is to have Australians provide more for their own retirement. So, in summary, our survey was completed by almost 1,000 respondents. It was an online survey in which we had the opportunity to ask 75 questions, so quite a detailed survey. Just some brief highlights before I go into the more detailed findings. Interestingly, the median amount in the superannuation account for our respondents was only $20,000. Their median income was approximately $50,000. If we had to identify the most important determinant for superannuation behaviour, and I'll talk more about that in just a few minutes, it is really whether or not the respondent has studied a business or commerce subject. A few other highlights before I go into more detail with our findings. 2/3 had never made a voluntary contribution to their superannuation fund. We examined levels of understanding of superannuation and some quite concerning results here. 43% of our almost 1,000 respondents couldn't get more than 3 out of 9 basic questions about superannuation correct. We asked them about their retirement plans. Almost 94% indicated they'd made no plans for retirement at all. 30% replied that they thought that everything would fall into place regarding their retirement. In relation to looking for help about sometimes quite complex decisions about superannuation, 40% thought that they could assess the pros and cons about superannuation without asking for any help. A couple of other key findings. We asked them to indicate their level of trust in the superannuation industry. And again, a concerning finding here. Only 23% of our respondents indicated that they trusted the superannuation industry. In relation to information they received from their superannuation fund, a little under 40% replied that they found it easy to read and understand their periodic statement. So they're just a few of our key findings. Let me now talk more about the sample, but our research findings. As I indicated, our survey was completed by almost 1,000 respondents. Our respondents came from across Australia, from capital cities, from regional cities, and from rural parts of Australia. Just under a third of the respondents are single, about a third have dependent children. In terms of the questions that we asked our respondents, I might just highlight the broad range of questions that we asked. Of course, we asked them some basic questions about their age, gender, the language that they spoke, where they lived. We asked them about their employment. We asked them about their income. We also asked them some information about their partner if they were in a relationship. We then asked them a series of questions about their actual superannuation fund. We then turned to ask them a series of questions about their understanding of superannuation in general. We also asked questions designed to elicit their level of financial literacy. We asked questions about their use of superannuation. And very importantly, we asked questions designed to assess their views and their attitudes towards superannuation, including their views and attitudes about retirement planning. We then concluded with the opportunity for them to give us some more detailed information in response to some questions such as their financial priorities at this stage of their life. So then just returning to the sample for a moment. Interestingly, a little more than 50% of our sample held a university degree. About 42% were currently repaying a mortgage. About 1 in 7 were still living with their parents. In terms of occupation, almost 40% described their occupation as professional, about 1 in 4 as blue collar. About 75% of our respondents were working full-time. So now we turn to the very important issue of what determines superannuation behaviour. And what do we mean by superannuation behaviour? Well, for the purposes of this research study, we were interested in things such as how much superannuation our respondents have in their superannuation account. What's their level of understanding of superannuation? What's their attitude to retirement planning? Those and related questions we refer to as superannuation behaviour. So, what are some of the key determinants that impact upon superannuation behaviour, either positively or negatively? Well, in summary, some of the key determinants are income. Certainly very significant differences in superannuation behaviour based upon the respondent's income. Other significant differences including whether or not respondents held a degree. compared to whether or not respondents had completed their education at the secondary school level. There were also a number of significant differences based on location, whether or not our respondents lived in urban areas of Australia or regional areas of Australia. Some significant differences based on language. In particular, as I'll talk about in just a few minutes, some significant differences based on whether our respondents spoke English or whether they were LOTE, in other words, language other than English respondents. And also, and this fits with other research findings, some significant differences according to whether our respondents were male or female. Now, when we conducted a series of regressions, and these tests are still continuing at the moment, one factor that really stood out in determining superannuation behaviour, and I mentioned this at the beginning, was whether or not our respondents had studied a business or commerce subject. Other determinants were things such as education level, gender and level of income, and of course whether or not the respondent was in the workforce or unemployed. We asked about current levels of superannuation balance, and as I've already indicated, the median amount was approximately $20,000, higher for males, $22,000, lower for females, $18,000. Interestingly, nearly a quarter of our respondents, in terms those male respondents, had under $10,000 in their superannuation balance. But for females, that proportion rose to nearly almost 1/3. Certainly, years does make a difference. So when we broke our demographic of those aged 25 to 34 into two categories, those aged 25 to 29 and those aged 30 to 34, those aged in the latter category, 30 to 34, had $25,000 as the median in their account balance, compared to only $15,000 for those in the lower aged category. Degree holders were much better off in terms of superannuation balances, a median of $23,000 compared to $14,000 for non-degree holders. So even though undertaking university study would, of course, in the short term, mean that those in that position forego the opportunity to contribute significantly to superannuation, they may, of course, be working part-time, compared to those who leave high school and go immediately into the workforce. What we see is, though, that those with a university degree rapidly catch up and rapidly surpass those whose level of education is completed at the secondary level. I've already indicated the positive impact of studying a business or a commerce subject. In summary, when we factor out some obvious determinants of superannuation balances such as age and income, significant influences then are factors such as career breaks in employment, propensity for casual or part-time work, and indeed whether or not the respondent is actually in the workforce. We asked respondents what age they joined a superannuation fund. It's a relatively young age, just under 19 years of age, and that age looks to be lowering. In other words, our younger respondents tended to be joining their superannuation fund at a younger age than our older respondents. Interestingly, those with a background language other than English were joining their superannuation funds on average 3 years later than those with an English-speaking background. Another finding in terms of switching funds, and there's not a lot of switching funds, is that those with a LOTE or language other than English background were switching less than those with an English-speaking background. Now, we asked a series of questions about investment fund options. What did our respondents understand about their various investment fund options within their superannuation account? About 1/3 couldn't answer the question about their investment fund options. In terms of those respondents who chose the growth option out of the various options available to our respondents, males, degree holders, high income earners, and interestingly, LOTE respondents all tended to score highly in terms of the proportions choosing the growth option. I've already mentioned earlier on that about 2/3 have not made a voluntary contribution to their superannuation fund. We asked about their understanding of superannuation through a series of 9 questions. Worryingly, 43% of our respondents couldn't get more than 3 of those 9 questions correct. In the same survey, we asked respondents to, in a sense, self-assess their level of knowledge at the same time that we also tested their actual knowledge of superannuation. Now, while about half of our respondents reported being well informed about financial matters in general, this dropped to about 1 in 3 of respondents who thought themselves well informed about superannuation issues. So quite a distinct difference then between those who feel as though they're well informed generally about financial matters and those who feel well informed about superannuation. Now, while more than half, about 56%, tended to do a lot of research about particular superannuation options before making a decision, only 1 in 3 thought that making such a decision was not complicated. In terms of retirement planning, and I mentioned this at the introduction, almost 94% told us they have made no retirement plans. And interestingly, 44% told us they've given retirement planning no thought at all. About 30% told us that they thought that things would just fall into place for their retirement. But about 45% didn't feel confident about how they should actually approach planning for retirement. Almost 40% told us that it was just more important for them to focus on short-term financial goals. It was interesting to ask them how much they thought they might need to retire based on current dollars. Just over half told us they thought they wouldn't need more than $50,000 per annum in their retirement. But how will that figure be constituted? Where are they looking to get that $50,000 per annum, or whatever figure our respondents thought they needed to, if you like, live comfortably during retirement? Interestingly, respondents told us that they expected only superannuation to make up only a little more than 50% of the income that they would need for retirement. So our respondents, despite government messages that people should be planning, and indeed a lot of emphasis given on superannuation for retirement planning, our respondents are telling us that superannuation is only part of it, and indeed they expect only a little over 50% of their retirement income to be based upon superannuation. 80% of our respondents told us that they have never or ever considered making changes to their investment fund options. What about looking for advice concerning financial matters and superannuation in particular? Our respondents told us that they're far more likely in the past 12 months to have sought professional advice about a mortgage than superannuation. And if they have talked to someone about superannuation, they're far more likely to have talked to a relative than to a professional advisor. In terms of confidence in superannuation, there's really not a lot of confidence. Only about 2 in 5 of our respondents said that they could assess the pros and cons of information from super funds without asking for help. 4 in 5, 80% of our respondents reported that most people they know don't talk about superannuation. I mentioned at the beginning that a concerning finding is a low degree of trust in the superannuation industry. Only 23% responded that they had trust in the industry. Almost 60% told us that they believed superannuation fees were not transparent enough. Only a little over a third agreed that reading and understanding periodic statements is easy. Well, let me conclude with one other part of the research, which is the relationship between actual understanding of superannuation and confidence, either underconfidence or overconfidence in their own abilities. So we compare, if you like, the findings to actual knowledge as we tested for it, and compare that with the findings about how our respondents self-assessed their understanding. Now, in general, there's a positive relationship. So, in other words, of course, the more confident one feels, then generally speaking, the better understanding that person has of superannuation. But there are some concerning findings. Rural males and rural females have low levels of understanding of superannuation. But those males, those rural males, tend to be overconfident in their understanding, in their own self-assessed understanding. Rural females tend to be underconfident. When we look at the urban males and females, certainly it's very clearly the case that their levels of understanding of superannuation are higher, but again, we see the same overconfidence on the part of males and underconfidence on the part of females. When we look at those respondents who have relatively low levels of income and low levels of education compared to other respondents, what we see here are low levels of understanding of superannuation and also lower levels of confidence in their own self-assessed understanding of superannuation. So that then is provides some insight into our key findings. As I mentioned at the beginning, we are conducting further testing with a very rich set of data that we have. And also, of course, we now move to explore some of the important implications of our findings. Thank you very much.
Well, Ian, thanks so much for your insights today and for your support of CIFR in this important research. What I'd like to do is just to reflect on some of the issues that you brought out in terms of your project and why perhaps ages 25 to 34 are less engaged with superannuation than, say, other age categories. I guess the first thing that I would like to ask is, given that these are Gen X and Ys and they've got a lot of engagement with technology and the internet and so forth, is there lack of engagement likely to be because there's an information overload?
So certainly it is absolutely correct that one of our key findings is a relative lack of engagement with superannuation, as reflected in a number of ways, not just how much money they have in superannuation, but how much thought they're giving to superannuation. Now, I'm not sure that we would say that it's a result of information overload. I think that what we could say is, and this certainly came through in what we would call the more open-ended questions towards the end of the survey. It's just that at this stage of life, they have other priorities. And in particular, those priorities are, in fact, we asked them to rank their priorities. Things like buying a house, or even ranked much higher than superannuation are things like day-to-day expenses. How do you get through life with cost of living being what it is at the moment? And so superannuation planning, thinking about what you might need, is really just postponed. But I would say that that's a concern. And that's a concern because, as I indicated in the main part of the presentation, government policy is to put more and more emphasis on self-funding for retirement. And given the clear evidence about inadequate balances, we need to be getting the younger generation to be thinking more about planning for the future, albeit that that's some way down the line.
In particular as well, the 25 to 34-year-olds don't necessarily have as much experience in life. Retirement for them is so far away in terms of time horizons. And you mentioned, obviously, they may have other more pressing financial objectives that, like buying a house, etc., than sort of planning for retirement. Have you got any suggestions on how public policy could be angled to increase the engagement that young people have with superannuation?
I think this is a very important question. It is interesting that government policy for many, many years has been driven by endeavouring to make superannuation financially attractive. So, of course, superannuation receives many, many benefits in terms of its taxation treatment. Now, that may work very well for some portion of the population, some particular demographics, but it's obviously not driving this particular demographic. But in terms of government policy for this particular group, no matter how many times we ask the question about their understanding of superannuation, the finding is by and large the same. There are low levels of understanding of superannuation. Now, and that's even more marked for certain of our respondents, particularly those, for example, in rural parts of Australia. I should say straight away that clearly there's a lot to be done in terms of education. But this isn't simply just giving people more information. We do know from so many studies that the more information that you give people, the more risk that in fact decisions may turn out to be quite poor. So much of the research coming out of the behavioural finance area at the moment, of course, illustrates that. And my colleague Andrew Godwin, who will be speaking today, also, of course, with his research on short-form disclosure as one way of trying to tackle information overload. So in the superannuation area, when we talk about education, it really needs to be highly tailored to the particular target audience that we are discussing. And that reflects precisely the earlier research that I mentioned when we were investigating levels of financial literacy of senior, the next group down, senior high school students. Education, and these students told us in the roundtables, the sort of education they need has to be closely tailored to their own particular circumstances. Broad-based general information is of limited use.
Based on your research and your expertise in the area, would you be in favour of a modification to the sole purpose test where younger people got to use some of their superannuation balance for a deposit on their first home?
So I'd probably be agnostic on something like that. I think that while, of course, a number of people have made arguments to change rules on access for superannuation, at the same time, it seems to me there are certainly some arguments not to do that superannuation is there for a particular purpose, albeit that, as some commentators say, Australia's a rather special place given the cost of housing in Australia. So I don't have a particular view one way or the other on that particular question. I should say, of course, that's certainly not something that we tested for in this particular research study.
Okay. And lastly, in terms of a superannuation fund, and obviously, you know, this age category, they're members of superannuation funds. Are there things that the superannuation funds themselves should be doing or could be doing better that actually improves the engagement, the tangibility, the knowledge, etc., of what superannuation's doing?
So again, we think it's helpful to actually divide Australians into demographic groups. Now, when we think about the information that we receive from our superannuation fund, is it divided according to demographics? Let me suggest no. It may be divided according to whether you're in the pre-retirement or the post-retirement age, but by and large, that's pretty much it. And yet, what our research and other research is telling us is that different groups, particularly different aged groups, have fundamentally different needs. Now, there's a cost to providing tailored disclosure as opposed to generic disclosure. But I would suggest that the benefits of this could in fact be quite significant. And the demographic that we've been examining for the research that I've been discussing today, I should add, is a demographic that, according to some other related research, is a demographic that is challenged in terms of levels of financial literacy. So once we break apart the broad group of working Australians to think about the specific needs of subgroups within that broad group, then it seems to me the answer is clear in terms of what funds should be doing. They should be working harder to provide tailored information suited to the needs of particular subgroups.
Okay. Well, Ian Ramsay, thanks so much for your research and a very interesting study, and we look forward to hearing the final outcomes.
Thank you, David. It's been a great pleasure to be here and, of course, a great pleasure to participate in this CIFR-funded research.
Thank you.